Right, we are all set.
Good afternoon and welcome to the third in our series of Colorful Conversations. I'm Chris Conway. I'm the Executive Director of the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce. Today's event is being facilitated by the Minority Business Network of the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce. I would like to just quickly thank our sponsors, Comcast Business, Post University, Liberty Bank, and the North Star Realtors. It is now my pleasure to introduce our facilitator today, Christopher Clark of Merrill, Bank of America. He is also the chairman of the Minority Business Network.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another colorful conversation. This one is an exciting one because as a parent, it's something that's near and dear to my heart. Today, we have three experts who have joined us to share their perspectives on the impacts of education on communities of color and what they've seen, what their lived experiences have been, and without wasting any further time, I would love to start with Adrienne and have her introduce herself. Adrienne?
Hi, all. Thank you for having me. I would not call myself an expert. I would call myself a parent who likes to stay involved and believes in equity in education, and likes to make sure that we have the proper partnerships and leadership, who believes in it also and is doing the work. Again, my name is Adrienne Billings-Smith. I am founder of Concerned Parents of Color of West Hartford. We are an organization that holds space on the topics and for parents of color and allies on the topics of education, mental health, and just building community in general. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much for joining us. Rosina.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm Rosina Haskins, the Director for Equity Advancement for the West Hartford Public Schools. And similar to Adrienne, I'm no expert either. I'm a lifelong learner. I am an advocate for equity. I am only an expert in my own lived experiences, but I'm an advocate for equity for all children. Ensuring that they have opportunities and access, and that our families and children feel valued, seen, and heard in our schools.
Well, thank you for that, Rosina. And Don, you're representing the farther end of the spectrum with higher education. Don, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
My name is Don Seiler. I'm University of St. Joseph there in West Hartford. I've been there I just finished my 7th year. My general focus is, I consider myself a pedagogue. So I spend a lot of time focusing on the ways that instruction and resources and the practices that occur in the classroom can be maximized to benefit all students. I work a lot with arts integration, do a lot of culture and equity work, and working with a few different school districts. But yeah, that's my background in general.
Right. Well, awesome. And thank you, all three of you, for taking the time to join us today and engage in this colorful conversation. So, I'll start with the elephant in the room, right? We are what appears to be the tail end of a pandemic. We have experienced a lot of turbulence, a lot of changes in our day-to-day lives. And this is particularly true for our children and the way education has been conducted over the past year. Let's talk a bit about the past year. And we all have our personal horror stories, our own personal frustrations. As a single dad of 3 daughters, I will absolutely tell you that I thought that distance learning was going to be the death of me. I think that teachers and educators deserve all the money and alcohol. You've earned it. But I'd like to start with something a little different. What do you think went well this year? Don't all jump at once.
No, I'll start because, I have been working with Rosina this last year. It's like our 1-year anniversary of knowing each other, and her, welcoming me into the room and to have a seat at the table. Working with the district, we as parents, we may go to some Board of Ed meetings, or we may just complain through email, this or the other, but to actually work with the district and to have a partnership in this equity work has been so eye-opening and inspiring. And it's helped me immensely to learn a lot more about the ins and outs of the system, and how, the district is trying to do the work. And for me, that has been so uplifting for what my concerns were as a parent, and what equity looked like in our classrooms. And to see that the district, even through a pandemic, was really going and making sure they were doing social justice work, they were doing social emotional learning. It it gave me hope, and it continues to inspire me and want to do more, to ensure our children or have these sort of leaders um, in the room.
I'll piggyback off of that. Thank you, Adrian. I've enjoyed the partnership that we've had. And I think that the pandemic and systemic racism and the ground-swelling reckoning with social justice has forced us to really recalibrate our partnerships. And it's brought about a call to action to address what's been often ignored or unspoken dynamics. But it's really pushed us to co-design a new model for our partnership in ways that we hadn't imagined before. And it's forced us to have some very uncomfortable conversations and to create more spaces to have conversations that foster and facilitate change.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard for me to say that it's something that's been going well, but I expected positive outcome from everything we've been dealing with is absolutely the fact that teachers have been, I don't want to say forced, because I don't want to make it seem like the teachers were doing something wrong in the first place. Teachers have been placed in a position in the children's humanity is much more prevalent. So it's much harder to just get involved in those quick curriculum rates. When you have children who are sometimes in the classroom. So it's pushed parents and teachers closer together in that they started to focus more on what the student weight. So I think that's one of the most unexpected things. In the higher ed level, it's a position where we have to start concentrating on, I think it's long overdue, concentrate more on making sure that is of how we train teachers. I know that we do have it in our programs now, but it needs to take priority, because all of the rest of the stuff can be focused on in its time. But that centering the human experience is extraordinarily important in terms of training teachers.
So it sounds like, from across the board, from all of your experiences, that the need for grace and the need for understanding the human experience has become incredibly important, and particularly in this time. What would you say are some of the effective strategies that you've seen implemented that absolutely need to be carried forwards? Oh, you're on mute, Adrian. Oh.
No, I was letting Rosina answer that one to start.
Oh, okay.
One of the things, I mentioned that we're having conversations that are really digging into our personal as adults to inform our professional. You mentioned having grace. We're recognizing that people are coming into this really complex work and from different places. And so we're having the conversations about race, racism, and oppression, and privilege, and power, and class, and all of those important topics. But we're doing that earlier with students. We're having those conversations in our classrooms. So more specifically, this year, and in partnership with many of our parents, like Adrian Billings-Smith and many other diverse community partners and parent leaders, we're providing students these assured experiences in their community classroom settings, where we are helping them to build and access their own social emotional learning skills, personal awareness, self-regulation, building empathy, building relationships with others, and just navigating the complexities of our national landscape. In addition, we're pairing that with some social justice education that's with the domains of diversity and identity and justice and action, and really helping students to see themselves in mirrors and see others in terms of diversity as windows, and navigating in action and having voice and role in facilitating change. So we've offered that as a guaranteed experience at all levels. At the elementary level, it's in our morning meetings. At the middle school level, it is in morning advisory, and at the secondary high school level, it's in our community settings. And so we're really relying on these standards and tools. It's not arbitrary. It's research-based information and tools and standards to really help our students to build personal skills, as well as those social justice education knowledge.
So the emphasis isn't just on the teachers building these skill sets and being able to relate to students. It's about the students learning these skill sets as well.
So social emotional learning is something that is not just for students, it's for adults as well, you know, and adults are having to grapple with their own personal experiences in order to inform their professional experiences. And Adrian, for example, has been a part of one of our parent work groups where we can't do this work alone. We recognize that our teacher diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, isn't what it should be. And so we've called in diverse representation in our community, in particular our BIPOC parents and caregivers, to bring their lens and their perspectives to our work so that we can do this together. And it's more of a dual capacity type of framework that we use so that they can continue the conversations at home and inform us. You know, if we're not getting it right, let us know. But I'll let Adrian speak to her experience in that partnership.
That would be great, Adrian. Can you chime in a bit and talk about your experience?
Yeah, you know, and I'm happy that you brought that up, because that's exactly what I was thinking about. I was thinking as being a parent of elementary student of a son and a niece, and their experience, because they're learning those pieces also, that social justice, that social emotional learning, and they're coming home and we're having different discussions than you can imagine with a second grader and a fifth grader than they might have traditionally had. And then for the district to allow parents to be a part of the process, it helps us as parents also, because we're also coming in with our own biases and our own lenses, but also we're able to see each other because we're working amongst each other as parents of color and allies to kind of form and mold what the district wants at the end of the day, because we're the closest people to our children. So our children come home and give us the back end of a lesson or a story or an experience that they had, and we're able to go and have a safe space to talk about it and create different things with this partnership with the district and be heard. And it's on this personal and professional level, but it's comfortable. But as Rosina says, there are uncomfortable conversations that are had in our groups amongst parents and the district. And we're figuring it out, but we're learning so much in the process that we're able to then take home with us as parents. So everything that the district is doing is going from the classroom to the kitchen. And that's how it needs to be. And we need to be having these discussions at home as well as in our classroom, so that we're all on the same page on what our students are learning, experiencing, and how we can help, further help them on their journey.
So I guess I'll switch a little bit as we talk about this, you know, the these learnings that we're having and these changes that were implemented. What are the challenges you're seeing with implementing these changes? What are the struggles? Everybody started smiling immediately because everyone has something that's top of mind. So please chime in.
But that's softball. That's also a hand grenade. It's so this question. I think these ideas are interrelated because what we're seeing is a lot of pushback against anything that challenges the status quo in terms of education. So is this equity work, but not in terms of discussion, but actually in practice and shifts in um, ideals and education in general. So I think the biggest challenges we're having right now is kind of the misinformed, um, and I'm trying to find polite ways of saying it, but kind of the misinformed pushback that has actually started to show more of its face lately. It's really a pushback against the status quo in terms of, in terms of history. So I would say one of the biggest issues, because all of us, every teacher, administrator has a life that they're trying to lead, and they're trying to um, not necessarily not become the target of a lot of vitriol. They're trying to do work that we know is good work. So I think that when you're doing something that good work is one of the biggest struggles that I last couple of years.
So would you say it's a function of people, being resistant to their lived experience being challenged? Right. So I didn't learn this in school. Why are my kids learning it? This isn't the way that I've experienced the world. Why are we putting this in front of the kids kind of situation?
It is a mix of that. It is also um, the ideals that we have been uh, told are our reality. So American history, the ideals about exceptionalism, is that there are going to be people for whom you are challenged their existence, their reality, the way that they see the world. And for some people, that isn't. So for some people, their reaction is not necessarily a cognitive reaction where they're like, I don't agree with this. Is more of a fight or flight response. So, and I'm not trying to rationalize anybody what we know is pretty good work. I'm experience. It's a much more complex issue, but I think that what people are people are trying to, just like Rosina and Adrian have said, ideas and these concepts and all these rich and vibrant and interesting and have so many facts down to you hate America, you hate this, and you like way down to something that is simple enough that they can agree or disagree. That's a psychological phenomenon, that's a social phenomenon, there's into it. But I will say that like many of the folks who are pushing back against it, there are larger groups that are aware of the fact that the pushback is less than authentic. But there are other folks for whom the pushback is an aspect of them reinforcing the reality, exactly like you said, Christopher, reinforcing the reality that they believe in. And when that reality is challenged, their response can be visceral.
I, I agree with Don. I think humans' natural reaction to change is fear. And when you take concepts that have traditionally been, as Rosina said, unspoken or ignored or whatever, and you take these concepts and you bring them up to the surface, and they're no longer just a page in your history book or this, that, and the other, and you actually want to dive down into them. People fear that because now it has to be spoken about. And when you're talking, and people like phrases, but they don't like phrases, because if you have a phrase like critical race theory, It's a very literal phrase. And if you go and you read what it means, then you understand all it is bringing all lenses into the story now. And people make those things political instead of recognizing that there are people who would like to have their lens be seen, heard, and acknowledged within the story and within the journey. And so when you can place fear into the equation, then people naturally will say what Don said: you hate America. This isn't how we were taught. We need to go back to the old way. And that's just not, the old way was not working for all of us. So for you to say something, equal for, for all of us, and this for all of us, then you have to include all of us at the end of the day. And until we start to do that and reckon with that, then we're going to continue to be misinformed, spread falsehoods, and leave, marginalized groups out of the picture once again. And we have a chance right now to actually sit down and talk about it, because we have an entire different generation who's leading us, entirely different generation that's leading us. And our next generation coming up, these high schoolers right now get it. When you speak, if you sit down and speak to a group of high schoolers, they get it. And we forget sometimes that we were the ones who taught them different things, whether it be being able to come out in the LGBTQI community, whether being able to be proud of who they are with their ethnicity, their nationality, their race, being proud of speaking more than one language. We did this. And now when they speak up and we're trying to bring that and embed that into our education, people want to push back on it, not recognizing that they were a part of what the youth are doing, and they're our next leaders, and they should be entitled to have a seat at the table also.
I want to co-sign and retweet what both Adrian and Don said. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Don, who looks like you chopped your dreads, but Don was with us when we started this journey on building our cultural competence in 2016. It was our first real, wasn't the beginning of our work and our journey, but it was, we were trying to reaffirm our commitment and make sure that everyone was on board or aware and felt like they had a individual ownership around our collective vision. And so he was here at the start of this, and so a lot of what he speaks about, he's really just strumming our own pain and struggles. And we've had the struggle of enacting equity. We do have a new educational equity policy that was just adopted last month by our school board. And similar to what Don shared, there has been reaction and pushback, a lot of questions about it. And in some cases being labeled by some people as a covert way of teaching critical race theory. And to me, that really gets in the way, becomes a barrier, becomes a distraction. We don't teach kids critical race theory. Critical race theory is a theory, and it's an academic framework for how we examine systems like housing and politics that marginalize racial groups. And so I don't think that what we're doing, and we stand unwavered, is we are teaching students how to be free thinkers around these issues that really perpetuate oppression and marginalization, and really allowing them to have a role in seeing themselves in their community and maybe take an action where they feel necessary, but certainly not attempting to indoctrinate anyone. And so that's what those charges, that's what gets in the way. And so sometimes we have to really actively block out all of that noise and just stay our course. And so we've tried to maintain a steady drumbeat about doing what's morally right for all kids. And so teaching pro-social education is what we stand by.
So I think that leads to another question. When we look at the critical race theory, we look at the lessons that we garnered from the pandemic, and we look at the changes that have been implemented. you know, what do you think is lacking in the curriculum currently?
The full narrative, accurate history. That's what's lacking, and that's the work that we're doing. Really telling the full history, accurate history, and being unafraid, and not placing blame or shame either. That's not what it's about. It's about moving forward.
Yeah, I am a huge proponent of representation. I often say that in order to be a thing, you have to see a thing or conceive a thing, right? Like you have to see it in practice, and or you have to be able to look at the landscape as it exists and go, okay, there's a hole here, and I have the skill set and the knowledge to fill that hole. And as we look at building out these curriculums, and we look at providing that representation in the classroom, it allows these students who have been left out, at least in my opinion, these students who have been left out and who have not had their history told, to go, wow, I can do this, or wow, this is an important part of where I came from, and these are the changes that I can make now knowing this, or their fellow students to go, wow, I didn't know that existed. I mean, I would even say as an adult, that's one of the conversations that I have a lot is, wow, I didn't know that, or I never knew that happened. What do you see as fellow parents and educators, and being involved in the district? What do you see as important pieces of history that need to be shared, that or things that catch people as surprising that they didn't know about?
I mean, in the last year, and some change, just getting involved with the district and just meeting other individuals like a Mike Keogh, and a Jason Chang, Dr. Chang, and have has opened my eyes. I'm well versed when it comes to African American history, but when the entire issue of Stop Asian Hate and whatnot happened, I was able to actually sit on a panel with some director of Far East Deep South, where it talks about the Chinese Exclusionary Act, talking about a family, the influx of Chinese Americans in the Mississippi Delta, those type of historical moments. I'm a firm believer that local history creates national history. That's the foundation of our history. And when you know those bits and pieces, you can start to see where communities have come together, have lived together, have built landscape together. So for me, I like and I want and I advocate for local history to be a huge part of our curriculum. I am doing a research project myself, which talks about slavery in Connecticut, which isn't talked a lot about, and its effects, and the difference of being a slave and being enslaved in Connecticut and being a free person who could live next door to you, and how the systems worked against and for both of you. So I just think that when we talk about um, curriculum and representation, like you said, Chris, you need to see it to know it. You need to see it to do better. You need to see it to believe in it. You need to see it so that your educational base is more full and robust, because then you can start to see your neighbor and their history, and you can start to learn about one another and know why we're fighting for equity. Because when you see someone started ahead of you, or your family benefit in the ways that their family didn't benefit, then you can start to have those discussions on a more empathetic level than saying the blame game, right? That thing. You don't want someone constantly feel like they're blamed for something that they personally did not do, but giving them a reason why there's issues and why we speak about reparations, then we can start to have real conversation about it.
I'll also add that before we can think about what's missing in the curriculum, I think we have to step back and reassess what of public education and education in general. So if we stick to the idea of it good, where it's just something that I can get and I can get my education and I can, um, then it's going to be harder for people to recognize the value of looking at all of these. Think about the education and the idea that it is a public good and it is something that is meant to enhance everybody's. Then we can say that if we are indeed, and get to this point, if we are indeed training the next generation of leaders and the next generation of innovators, they need to understand the world as best they can. They can't innovate or do anything great if they think of, if they've only seen history that has been sanitized, existence around the world that has been sanitized. So if we're not talking about what's happening in Myanmar, if we're not the reason that there are people in Colorado and Montana are still talking about the border, like if we're not examining the fact that all of these migrant people have ended up and their history and their roots run extraordinarily deep all across. Uh, let's keep everything really simple. Let's talk about chopping down cherry trees and never telling a lie, because that, but then let's leave everybody else's story out, or a couple of stories just to prove that we are not being, overtly oppressive. So we're going to allow Dr. King to be talked about. We're going to allow Frederick Douglass to be talked about. We're going to allow ID to be talked about, but only talked about in terms of a couple of different things. George Washington Carver. I say the name and you know what you were taught about, but you don't understand the processes. So if we're trying to churn out students who can really have to understand the actual world that they were coming from. So this is why we can still address the needs of marginalized students, and it will be better for all of the students. It is absolutely better for a white student to find out that the kid the border wall around these kids is great when you're now you're assuming that Latino means one specific thing instead of actually understanding the different backgrounds and different experiences. So I think we have to step back and think about what education is supposed to be doing. That gives us the basis for what's important. We are doing it because the students to be informed about the world and better prepared to make important decisions and find success and kind of bridge the cultural gaps. There are so many different ways in which our world has evolution. Prior to 20 years ago, constantly have information to wait until 11 o'clock and watch the news, and the news decided what we saw. And now we have constant connection. We know exactly, like I think about the Arab Spring that happened a few years ago. An entire revolution occurred, and it was being created through social unique. So if our students don't understand how that's happening, why that's happening, then they're going to end up in a situation where they're not going to be able to success, and their contributions to the world are going to be limited because their understanding of the world is limited. So I think that's one of the main things we have to do is think about for everyone. Everyone doesn't not still focusing on the marginalized, the needs of our marginalized kids, our special ed kids, our kids who are spectrum. We're not focusing on them. The fact that helping, we're trying to equalize things. We're trying to make it um, so that every student has potential for equity in their outcomes, as opposed to
You said something that was really interesting to me, Don. Right, the idea of, well, you mentioned kids on the spectrum and other marginalized students, and just in some of my research and some of the conversations I've had, like one of the things that we find is that children of color tend to have higher suspension rates, higher rates of disciplinary actions, you know, uh, uh, when we think about like some Asian students, like they don't necessarily get the same level of supports that they would need in school because of the some of the model minority uh, thought process that goes along with being Asian. You know, so they don't have access to the supports that some other students would have in terms of special education and so forth. You know, how can we combat some of those inequities that we're seeing, those inequities when it comes to access?
So, Zena said, which is the importance of having a classroom and connecting parents and connecting teachers, but connecting students too, seeing what the students need, understanding what the students need. There is a huge part of it that I will say is group. We should be helping teachers to see um, ways in which they're students without necessarily sacrificing curriculum. So we need to do a better job recruiting, retaining, and training people who are um, understanding of different student needs. Because when you talk about suspension rates, when you talk about the fact that that idea of the Asian model minority, even though, so what happens with the Asian model minority is exactly what you said, Christopher. You have this belief that all Asian students acumen, and then you have students who come from different countries, different groups, different cultures all together. Even though we think of that as a positive stereotype, which is kind of an ironic term, and students end up not getting exactly as you said. They don't get what they need because people assume that they don't need or that they should excel. But a lot, the same as the suspension rate and the amount of students of color who are specific diagnoses. Um, a lot of that is teacher perception. Districts, the same teachers are the ones who are consistently referring students of color to discipline. They're the same teacher. Teacher is just misbehaving, gotta, but not addressing, and this is what Rosina and Adrian were talking about. If ideals and the way that people are thinking about their students, then we're not going to be able to make a difference, because the lack, a lot of those things come back of students, and if those perceptions aren't in teacher education, if they aren't shaped in teacher education, it's going to be very hard to make a huge change or an effective change once they're out in the with them. So I would say that part of it can occur in the education, have to do a better job of recruiting, retaining, and supporting people, teachers who are willing to address their own issues, their own misconceptions about students.
You could not have said that. No one could say that any better than you. And I want to say that I completely agree with you with respect to the work that we could be doing. We have fully acknowledged in West Hartford Public Schools, or have attempted to fully acknowledge our shortcomings and give some context to what we have attempted, and be straightforward that it's just not enough and it's not good enough for our students. And so the work that we need to do, it really is in that professional learning. It is in teacher recruitment, racial, ethnic, linguistic, diversity recruitment, not just recruitment. It's not enough to get them, but we have to keep them. And so we have to support them too, so that, you know, teachers of color do not shoulder the color tax burden of being the only. Also, I think that it's the resource allocation as well. And it's bigger than just our school systems. It's no accident, I imagine, that Adrian's here and you are too, Don, because it's about the larger community. Everyone needs to have individual responsibility in this collective and shared vision of equity. And I really feel like in order for us to heal, the pathway to reconciliation is truth, it's acknowledgement. And that's our pathway to healing. The other piece I wanted to wanted to mention is just how our students see themselves. Like social media plays such a big role. It permeates the race and social dynamics permeate media and their daily lives. And so really, I think we have to combat those stereotypes, not just in the classroom setting, but just in our communities too, and reframe the narrative so that they're accurate and they help students to develop personal self-awareness and personal self-concept of who they are, and so that they can amplify their voices to challenge that single story. I'm reminded of the Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Ngozi. And just have to keep pushing. But, you know, it's larger than just the institution of education. You know, it cuts across all areas of our municipality. And so I think that that's the work. We have to, you know, hear stories. We have to stretch our arms. We have to call people in instead of calling people out often. And, you know, going back to creating policies that really serve the greater community.
Yeah, I will say you're absolutely right that it's a lot broader than education. You know, I look at, you know, my lived experience. I look at, you know, my family background. A lot of my family members and friends are in medicine. And you look at the difference in treatment that patients of color receive from the same staff that a white patient will receive. You know, some of my friends in anesthesiology, in anesthesia, have relayed stories where, you know, somebody wakes up from an anesthetic and they're surprised and they're shocked and, you know, sometimes combative. And, you know, if it's a white patient, you know, the thought is, oh, come, you know, don't worry, you're in a safe place, you know, you're fine. If it's a patient of color, it's restrain them. You know, we don't want them going crazy in the OR, right, or the recovery room. So it as you said, it permeates so many other aspects of our lives. And, you know, it goes across into social media and so on and so forth. But, you know, if we can make the changes early on in the game, you know, we can put things in a better position for the future generations. You know, you said something, Rosina, that I wanted to go back to, the color tax burden. Can you do a little bit of a deeper dive on that and explain what that means?
Yeah, I mean, it's being when you're in an organization where you know, there's a lack of racial, ethnic, or linguistic diversity, or I mean, there are other identities too, and intersectionalities as well. But, you know, I'm kind of situated in my own experience here in West Hartford Public Schools. We're trying every year, we're trying to be innovative and bringing in talented, high quality educators who who our students, that represent our student backgrounds. And it's just been such a challenge. But when we get someone, sometimes that educator may be the only African-American male in their school. And the color tax burden becomes, oh, you know, you speak for all African-American males, you speak for all Black people, right? Or you speak for all transgender people. So feeling like shouldering that, or being that person that, oh, well, all of the Latinx students are going to go to this particular teacher for help, or when I have a discipline question, because that's the teacher, that's the Latino teacher in the building, the only one. So that must be the authority in our school. And that gets to be a lot for those teachers to shoulder that. And so they need a circle of support as well. And really, everybody's got to do this work on building our social consciousness. Everyone's got to do the work in building our equity muscle, flexing it, digging into our own biases and understanding marginalization and privilege and power. It needs to be shared. And so it becomes a color tax burden when you are an only and everyone's looking to you to be either the savior or they are the light savior unnecessarily, unsolicited. So those are just some of the experiences that I know that some of our educators and my colleagues just across the nation have shared in terms of their lived experiences in predominantly white organizations.
So what we colloquially call the designated, or at least from my seat, the designated black guy syndrome, where you're designated to be the representative for your people or your group, and the one point of reference that most people have. Yeah, as we talked about, different points of origin, different languages, and so forth. I think about my lived experience as a kid of Caribbean parents, right? My mom came from Trinidad, my dad came from Barbados, and interactions with teachers and interactions with the educational system were seen as a negative. And I know in my conversations with a lot of other immigrant kids, that still tends to be the perception, right? So it is absolutely a thing where it's like, oh my God, the teachers are calling the house. What did you do wrong? How did you embarrass the family? Right. So how do we engage families where there is that cultural or even a language barrier, to get them involved in the shared experience of creating this better educational outcomes for their kids and this better educational system collectively?
We have to redesign our systems the way it is right now. We have to integrate family engagement into our equity agenda, as we've tried to do here in our district. And we need to hear the voices of our parents and our caregivers. They are our students' first educators. They bring so much funds of knowledge into the classroom and into the schools. And so it really requires intentional strategy to build trust, to deepen the relationships with families, and really to pave the way for our educators to recognize the funds of knowledge and social capital that our parents bring and how much they can really advance opportunities for our children, for them to thrive and have the best life chances ever. That's where it is. It's all in. It's not extra work. It's not an add-on. It is a B work.
I think one of the uh, biggest travesties of them is convincing students and teachers that they have to leave who they are at the threshold of the school building and become someone else while um, because what that has done is teachers, it's cut the teachers off from the students, it's cut the families off from what's. So I think one of the first things, and kind of I think Rosina kind of alluded to this, is ensuring that there is a clear connection between. Connection has to be a community connection. So it can't just be that the teacher emails the house. It doesn't matter if the teacher emails the house 10 times a week. Um, the teachers have to get to know the students and understand the students as a part of that initial information gathering that they do every year or every time they have a new set of students. They have to allow the students to their comfort to get to know them. Because then what will start happening is when the students go home, they're not just talking about the teacher as this person gave me work. They get to say, oh, the teacher talked about their dog today. Oh, and they start to have this. And so when the teacher starts that communication, that's a real person that the family is talking to. But that's a whole, not necessarily just something that has to be on teachers. But I think breaking down that barrier, that wall between the students' home lives and the students' school lives. And you said that students need to be able to see things in action. So they need to be able to have lived as opposed to just having kind of these canned curricular learning experiences. And that's a huge part of helping them to see that what they're learning in their life, it means something in the real world. So having the teachers learn more about the students, their background, their culture, their identity is, and I know Rosina and Adrian have mentioned this, identity is huge. Understanding more about who the students are, understanding more about their background, make the mistake of calling a home that is, there are all kinds of different cultures where if a teacher can't, the students don't talk back to the teachers. Some cultures, teacher in the eye. So the more information the teacher can gather at the beginning, the less likely they are to kind of compound mistakes. Um, so I still think, and Rosina, you're in that echelon of, you know, building that school community, a community where the parents feel welcome to contact the teacher, where the teacher feels welcome to contact the parent, and there's an ongoing dialogue. But that's not something that's just for teachers to do or just for parents to do. It has to be a part of the entire school district initiative.
I agree with Don and Rosina. It's changing the culture at the end of the day. And when you um like you're talking about, Chris, about being, if someone calls home, you're like, oh no, please don't call my house, don't call my house. You have to build those relationships. And it does have to be very intentional in how you do so. And you have to look farther than, everything is so merit based when it comes to education, merit and results based. And we've built that because we have these expectations of our students, our community, our teachers, that as a parent, you want the teacher to be good, so your student will be good and they'll go off to college and they'll do this, that, and the other. And then we started to realize that now we're like losing the person, we're losing the individual and all of that, because that's all they're focused on is making this grade or getting into this club or being and making sure that, instead of sitting down and having these conversations, like Don said, and getting to know the student. And it's hard because there's not, let's be honest, there's not enough funding to have 15 students in a class. There's not, you have to think about all the basic things. We want a lot of things, and there's ways to try and build that, but it comes down to resources a lot of the time. And if you got 30 kids in a classroom, thankfully we don't have that in West Hartford, but if you go to larger spaces like a Chicago public school and they have 32 third graders in a classroom, you can't get to know every single student as hard as you try. And you can't get to know every single parent as hard as you try, because you also have to remember there's a human aspect. The teacher is a human who has a family and other responsibilities also. So there's this balance of how you build that community. And I think by having these parent partnerships, I think by getting parents more involved through PTOs and EDI groups, then you can start to build it. It's in the classroom, but it goes further, because I think it's, you know, me speaking from the parent perspective, it's our responsibility to build community. It can't just be on the district to build the community. It's an entire team effort. So if you want the teacher to know your student, then you should know something about your students' educators. You should at least know their names. You know, have a conversation with them. Go to your conferences and have a legit conversation that focuses around their educational experience, but also it's simple. It's common. It's like human respect. Ask them how they're doing. Ask them about their family. That's how you build community within these educational spaces, because then they will reciprocate. And I think that we as parents have to take on some of that responsibility and get back to being involved in what our students are doing and what's happening in the school building.
Yeah. So I wrote down class size. That was in huge letters, you know, on my notepad as you were speaking. And I'm glad that you touched on the fact that it is a matter of resources and so forth. But, you know, something else that came up, you know, as you were all sharing, the idea of merit, right? The idea that, you know, particularly in school, it's a meritocracy. And particularly, you know, for some parents, that's the way that they look at their kids going through the school system. It's, you know, my kid does well, they'll advance, they do what they're supposed to, they keep their head down, and they'll get out of the system and they'll go to a good college and they'll get a good job and they'll get a pension, which doesn't exist anymore. But like, you know, they're on this path. And culturally, a lot of times they're not taught like they understand the idea of community in their culture, but not along this path. It's that delineation between school and work and home life, and they're two separate entities. What do you see as as potential points of outreach to those parents who very often through cultural or language barriers don't necessarily know that these things are going on, or don't necessarily see them as important to their kids' educational development?
I don't want to sound so simplistic, but I think the very first thing we have to do is reject the deficit-based views of families. That's where we need to start. And once we do that, we can make assumptions about, oh, a parent, someone mentioned in the chat, what about single parents or parents that work? Well, that's kind of what I was getting at when I talked about reimagining and reinventing our systems, because we have to be able to we have to make schools accessible to parents. I appreciate everything and the ownership that Adrian speaks of as a parent or caregiver, but really, parents are entrusting their kids to us. We have to show that initiation and open. We have to stretch our arms open and build trust and build relationships and let them know that they have a seat at the table with us, that they're their parent partners, their shoulder partners, and that we need them. And so I think at the very root of it, we've got to push back on this deficit-based lens, because they didn't show up, that they don't care. What can we do to open up our doors so that they feel welcome and so that they can show up? We can meet them where they are. I think that's just something it's basic, and it's really free.
And I want us to answer the question in the chat also. As far as I just recently became the PTO president. I know, another thing I'm doing at at my son's elementary school, and we talk about that. We have people, students who don't necessarily live in West Hartford or wherever, and they're coming in. So you have to not only, and I so appreciate my principal, because she tries to make things accessible. She tries to make something at 9 a.m. and something at 6 p.m., right? She tries to make sure that she's getting the most amount of participation out of parents, and recognizing we all can't be everywhere, right? So as a PTO president, for me, it's about making sure there are things that we're doing as families, but also making sure we're leaving space for parents to do something together, to get to know each other, so they can call upon others for support. And to help them communicate if they can't make it, and do something, and making sure that we're communicating with all parents, and allowing and giving options and of how they can be a part of it. So you can't make the snowman making it 10 a.m. But hey, can you volunteer? We're going to do something on a Thursday night at 7 p.m. Can you come and do this? And here's a family thing, and start doing things where you start, like I said, building community. It's like, no, Rosina, yes, you are in trust. We entrust the educators with our children, but we also have to give grace, and we also have to see each other as a community, as a parent community, supporting our school at the same time. So we have to be there for each other, but we have to find these relationships. So if we only do things at 10 a.m., we're not going to get the parents that can do stuff at night or on the weekend. We're not going to see those kids, and then those kids feel left out of not being able to go to a play date. So you have to give people options. You have to let people know that you're accommodating and that you believe that they belong in your community.
Yeah, it's interesting, because there was a collective of fathers that I was a part of. We referred to ourselves as the bus stop dads, because every morning before work, we would be at the bus stop, getting our daughters off to school. And we were standing around, just thinking about the way school is structured, or at least in our experience and our lens of it. And we're like, wow, it is absolutely structured for, the family that can afford a stay-at-home parent, for one parent to be home, because so many things happen during the course of the day, and there were so many activities. And we were just like, dude, I've got to work. I've got to go in, and I've got to make sure that things happen in the office, and I can't make that event. And and that's why for us, it was important for us to build that little community of bus stop dads so that we could all keep each other in the loop of things that were going on, but also, to try and attend, the evening science fair, or the outdoor festival, or field day, or the weekend events, so that you could build that community. So it absolutely, it is important to try and find those workarounds and try to find those abilities to build community and to build structure and to participate in your kids' educational experience where you can. Um, but it goes back to the point that was made a little earlier, and I think about, like, even broader spectrum, because all of these things that we talk about, they can absolutely be tied to the broader experience of people of color within this country. You cannot ask for access to a room if you don't know the building exists. Like anybody who's been a member of the chamber and been a member of the Minority Business Network has heard me say this 1,000 times. And I think that applies to education. When you distill it down, a lot of these parents who don't have, who aren't necessarily living in the school system that their kid is getting educated in, who doesn't necessarily, have availability in the 8 to 3 hours, they're not necessarily getting the message. And so they don't know that the building is there. They don't know that the community is there. They don't know that they have the capacity to participate. Um, and I think I'm throwing the question back out. How do we find that workaround? How do we get the word out? Because I think about, the business community, and just share an example. That's why we created the Minority Business Network. I'm a huge proponent of, each one teach one. Each one of us is responsible for spreading the word and getting the information out to somebody that we know can use that information because we've benefited from it. Do you think that's applicable for parents? Do you think that's applicable for teachers?
I do. I think that, we all possess some type of power or some type of tool or resource or talent that we can use. And like to the chat, Jesse's point, we learned so much that from this year, and we have to continue to build on those things. Let's not go back to some of the old ways. We've had parents and caregivers and grandparents from across the country have access to our schools and in our classrooms with our students. We've been able to learn from people from who have families in different countries by inviting them to our virtual world. I think that the more we like look around and look at like who's not at the table, and who are we hearing from so much, we're giving a lot of airtime to a lot of the same people. um, let's let's leave no stones unturned when it comes to representation and calling people, looking for them and welcoming them and letting them know we're here. Here's a seat at the table for you whenever you can be here. We just have to do more of that. We can't keep this, we can't keep power to ourselves.
So do you think it is kind of like the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the time and attention goes towards solving the problem of the 20% of the vocal community? Because I don't think it's just parents with access or parents who really know. I think you probably have a very vocal minority of parents. And Adrian is smiling.
I don't know if it's the 80-20 rule, but I think, yeah, the louder you are, you have to be paid attention to. Like, let's be real about that. But as Rosina says, you have to intentionally go look for those parents and see who's missing at the table. And you have to let them know that they have access, and that you have to let people know that you care and you want them there. You don't want them to sit at the table just to be sitting at the table. You want to hear about their experience. You want to know what their needs are. You want to know what resources they bring to the table, because you're building a relationship at the end of the day. And whether that be 80-20, 60-40, or whatever, It has to be something so that you guys are benefiting from one another. Because once you're it's gonna, they bring the next person, as you were talking about, Chris, bringing the next person to the table, and they say, hey, there's this thing that's going on, and they bring more people into the fold at the end of the day. And I think that's how we have to do it. And it's the work is never ending. So it's never ending, and we have to you have to stay, it has to continue. And we have to find new and better ways to do that and to improve upon that, and bring people in who want to do the work with you, and even people who don't want to do the work with you, bring them in, because they need to want to do the work at some point, because we all want to um have a piece of the pie, or be at least invest in it.
Can I answer Jesse's question? Sorry, Adrienne, were you? And I think these conversations are really good when you can come away with some practical takeaways. So I love that in the chat, she's asking some questions about what can we do? What are some tangible things that we can do? Using our influence, using social media. Absolutely. I think that one of the easy things that we can do is ask each other, what are your hopes for your children? What is the best way to reach you, or the best time to reach you? Because we make a lot of assumptions, and I think that we waste resources when we do, because they're not meeting needs and not meeting people where they are. But I think the easiest thing to do is just to ask those questions and see how we can best provide access to everybody.
And going back to the idea of community, it's not necessarily just um, who's in the room, who's talking. It's about what is the overall environment like, and what are the aspects of the environment. So I see Jesse's question about using digital or social media, but when we're talking about, like, when we think about, all right, so this is what they're getting from the book, but how are we making so that there's some actual investment in it, so that when they talk to their parents, or that there is a connection there, so that when something is posted on Facebook, they understand. So it's not necessarily about how do these different pieces do their own individual jobs. It is about how does your district's community and district kind of sense of oneness permeate all of these different components. So that gets to, talking to different families, that gets to the student's curriculum, that gets to identity. The more you can make these things all real, and I think a good way to think about this is, the people who will push back will always say, well, this is not how I learn. Yeah, but this is a better way to learn. Every bit of evidence suggests that experiential learning, students actually having a very small window between when they learn something and when they apply it, and the relevance of that learning to their lived experiences. All of the students' retention, it increases student understanding, having students reflect on these things. So to teach, and a lot of our teachers are already doing it. I work with hundreds of teachers every single year, in-service teachers, and they're doing it. All I teach, I'm the skills that they already have. So kind of breaking down all of those silos between home and school and identity, like breaking down those silos and making it so that all of these things flow together, means that when you Facebook, the family has already heard about it, or at least has some inkling supposed to be about. So that thread going through everything becomes even more important in terms of really helping the students do better in general, and really establishing that connection.
Don, you said something really important. You talked a bit about the idea of of how all these pieces fit together, right? And breaking down these silos, you know, and that the way that we learned initially, or as we as adults learned, is different from the way that our kids have learned. And one of the things that always strikes me is how difficult it is for people to let go of the way that they learn. Like if you look at any other you know piece of technology or any other thing that has existed. Cars have gone light years in the way that they were built 100 years ago. Telephones, it went from being something that was plugged into the wall and with a rotary dial to being Star Trek technology in our lifetime, right? But education, for the most part, the way we teach, has stagnated. Why do you think that people are so resistant to changing the educational system?
All right, another hand grenade. All right. For some people, there's this idea that the way I learn, okay, otherwise I have to acknowledge that there's something wrong with me or something wrong with me. They're going to have to convince themselves anomaly, and that takes all of those things. Take a lot of work, cognitive work. You
Yeah.
know, education is not necessarily new. So you had Dewey saying all of these different things that we are now just building a body of research to support. You had Howard Gardner in the '80s, and some of his work is a little bit over simplified, but all of these ideas have been there. The reason that they haven't gone anywhere or haven't had as profound an effect is not because of the teachers. Like I said, I work with these teachers. I bring stuff up and they're like, yeah, I do that. So I had to restructure in my first couple of years. And after the first couple of years, I was like, oh, they already do this stuff. They might not have the vocabulary. They might not be able to rationalize it the same way, or maybe let's just kind of hone these things down. But the teachers are doing a lot of the stuff that we know is good, but then they find themselves pulled back and required to use specific curricular approaches, and they have to be on a certain page on a certain day. So there are some higher structural things that are stopping really high quality teachers from doing what they want to be able to do. Um, but we're still talking about the importance of just looking at the ways in which learning is a natural phenomenon. Like I'm learning something listening to everybody talk today. And we just saw somebody quoted what you said, Christopher. It's like all of us are constantly learning. Part of the reason that this learning is distinct is because we're not just reading it from a book. Nobody is simply like, there's not one of us that's just lecturing. And that's not to say that there aren't students who learn really well from text or learn really well from lecture. There are students who learn really well traditionally, but forcing all students into that has produced these inequitable outcomes. So I think it's about broadening the ways in which we teach students and helping everybody to see that these are valuable ways of doing things. But I really feel like part of the brick wall has been, I'm being cautious because I don't want to go down too far down the rabbit hole, but like the federalization of education is not, it's a good thing in some ways in terms of somewhat equalizing funding, giving funding, that's not just based locally on local taxes, but at the same time, it has increased that focus on things like testing and standards. And standards are not a bad thing, but standards are not goals. So standards are kind of the baseline, but we are using them as goals, and then we're structuring an entire curriculum around a baseline. So even right there, we're kind of limiting what students can do. So I think it's about like we said before, broadening the perspectives, making sure that the ways in which but we know these things about how people learn. We've known them for a long time. It's just hard to get past that. It's not necessarily an administrative block. It's kind of a social cognitive block. We don't like to acknowledge that we had something bad. We don't like to acknowledge that we are not unique and special.
So how do we, because I think you brought up a really great point, Don, another really great point. Yeah, how do we strike that balance between social and emotional learning? All of these things that we're saying that are important for our kids and their development, and the academic assessments. The once again the merit or metric based approach to education.
There suggests that good, effective teaching, and you actually see this. There's this weird phenomenon where we think we see like a failing school. Like this happened school, quote, failing, still according to No Child Left Behind. Um, they closed the schools, they took the schools over. They started to, what you'll see happen a lot of times is when a school is struggling, they start to truncate and simplify the curriculum and start taking things away. They take away the arts and they take away extracurriculars. But then when we, instead of like looking at the schools that are successful and looking at the things that made those schools successful, we just think if we take away all these distractions, they're going to do better. But then they don't do better and they end up being taken over. So we see what's successful. We see these school districts that have robust theater programs. These schools where the students are learning math by actually going out and working in businesses. Like we see what is successful, but that takes time, it takes money, it takes effort, it takes training. We're not willing to invest that in some communities as much as it is readily invested in other communities. And part of that is the communities have their own resources. Part of it is just like, could you imagine going to a really wealthy school district and saying, we're going to take away your theater program? Could you imagine the outrage? You
You
know,
would have fist
that
fights.
like there's that whole social capital aspect. We know what works. We understand the value of the arts. We understand the value of experience, but those things cost money and they take time and they take training. And I think socially, we just have not been as willing to invest as much in struggling districts or with struggling students. We think that if we narrow the focus, that's just magically going to make them somehow more prepared or find, you know, success later on.
Yeah. So we had a question from the audience, and has Common Core had a positive, negative, or neutral impact on educational disparities?
You're killing me.
I can see Don and I are going to end up having a conversation.
Well, I will say Common Core as a concept is not bad, right? Making sure that every student gets the same baseline of information is not bad. That's not a bad idea. Just to make sure that equitably, and when you, if you ever get a chance to look up some of the videos that they put out when Common Core was just being introduced, that's exactly what they said. We're gonna, you know, they had all of these graphics, the whiteboard graphics about, you know, we're gonna make sure that the child in Chicago is learning the same information as the child in Detroit, just to make sure that they're equal. But what happens when the funding is not equal? What happens when the testing has a different relevance? A wealthy school district they can struggle on testing and not see the negative repercussions that other school districts see. So it's not Common Core itself. If you've ever read the Common Core standards, the National Core Art Standards, the NGSS science standards are outstanding. If you read the standards, they're fine. But it is that idea of setting the standards as the goal that's problematic, because then everybody's racing to get to the baseline. But it's also the idea of letting that be, it can't guide instruction. It can be a checkpoint. It can be something to help you figure out, like some of the standards are about just having students get comfortable speaking. So when you're too rigid with that, when you're, you know, maybe students can speak through spoken word. You know, maybe they can do their public speaking through a rap song, through singing, through a monologue, but we have this tendency to think they need to give a political speech. So I think it is that narrowing of the ideas that's the problem. Common Core as a concept. I will say there are people who worked on developing the Common Core that were frustrated because the whole thing about the Common Core was that they got experts in all of these different fields to come together and come up with their ideas of what should be happening in the schools, what we should be aiming for. And then when it was actually released, it wasn't the exact same or as what a lot of the educators had agreed upon. So there's still going to be some negative feelings around that. But the standards themselves are not inherently bad. It is the pressure-filled assessments that came along with Common Core that have proven problematic. And there are hundreds of different reasons why having a standardized assessment, um, even across a district, is problematic. When you have it across a state, when you have it across a region, if you have it across a country, that's even more problematic, because then how do you deal with issues of inequity in funding, inequity of the backgrounds of the teachers, inequities of all the other things, whatever the students are dealing with outside. So I think that this is the testing that became the issue. It is the assessment that's more the issue than Common Core itself.
Don, would you agree that that can probably be applied to almost every educational reform that we've seen, No Child Left Behind? I think that what I liked most about the concept of Common Core was that student outcomes wouldn't be predictable by zip codes, but it goes back to what you talked about, and that's differentiation. And that I think we fell into a trap with the mandates, the word common itself, people took that to mean everybody gets the same. And so we lost a little bit, which I think we're regaining now, but we lost a little bit of the license to be creative and to think deeply about how we teach. It's what we teach, how we teach is as important as what we teach. And so we're really moving forward with culturally responsive pedagogy, and really trying to reach children and how they process information in a variety of ways and what they bring in terms of their own experiences, and ensuring that they see themselves and their narratives and their experiences and their histories in the context of teaching and learning. I think Common Core kind of set us back a little bit there when we started to talk about addressing inequities, but it focused more on equality, where too many students were expected to get the same, regardless of where they sleep at night. And I think we're starting to shift a little bit and really meet the spirit of Common Core as an equity lever. I think I asked you, would you agree? Then I went on to keep talking.
That's okay. Yeah, yes, I absolutely agree. I think we hear the term nanny state a lot, but I think what Common Core and the assessments that are associated with it was kind of a nanny state. You ended up with everything being guided towards that and focused on that. And No Child Left Behind really was, well, No Child Left Behind wasn't the first idea to do it. No Child Left Behind was just the first time that we started punishing schools, like not just, you went from schools just not being successful to schools being taken over, schools being closed, schools losing funding just based on test scores. So yeah, Rosina, I think you're absolutely right. It wasn't the Common Core itself, it was the way it was implemented. And that has happened I think that happens every time there's ed reform. But it really comes down to, like, when you saw the movements towards community control in places like Chicago and Oakland, it was almost like it was destined to fail, because they made it so that, oh, you want parents and families to have partial control, but we're going to make sure that you hate the teachers so that you actually can't get things done. So every reform has been met with these kind of limitations and barriers that stopped it from realizing what it could potentially be. But yes, Rosina, it is absolutely stripped a lot of teachers in a lot of places from, like, it's taken their creativity, it's taken their options. Most of them still engage in these creative practices, but then they still have to kind of twist that knob to make it all back to Common Core language or Common Core perspectives. So it's more of an implementation thing than the actual plan and idea itself.
So we are absolutely butting up on the end of our time. This has been phenomenal. This has been educational. I so much that's circling around in my head, and I think this would probably warrant another conversation. I want to thank Adrian, Rosina, and Don for contributing and for sharing your time and sharing your thoughts. Before we sign off, is there anything that you want to leave the audience with? Any parting thoughts? Any piece of information that you say, I've got to get this out to the universe before our time together ends today? Or anything that you want to push people to think about? Or any solutions or resources you want to put in front of our audience?
I think as we were closing up on Common Core, the one thing I'm reminded of is that we don't teach English, science, social studies, and math. We teach children, and we just have to make sure that we keep children in the center of everything that we do.
I
Wow.
second that.
And I think that to add to what Rosina said, part of the way that we do that is by making sure that what happens in the classroom and what happens school adjacent is still considering their humanity. Like their scores, their grades are not who they are. But the curriculum and the way that that is approached can be rooted in who they are. So finding out what we can about students as we are planning, as we are developing, as we are augmenting and changing and assessing, getting as much information about the students as possible and using that to benefit their education, having them become active participants in their own success, as opposed to just allowing them to just wait until the grade is do the work, wait for the grade, do the work, wait for the grade. They need to be actively connected to what's happening, and that can bring families even closer to what's happening in the classroom.
So there you have it. We honor and appreciate you all for joining us and contributing. Um, in addition, wanted to give a special shout out to Yukio Aeda, who has provided us with some amazing resources that you will be able to find on the Minority Business Network's page on the West Hartford Chamber website. Um, for those of you who want to share this conversation with your friends, once again, each one teach one. It will be available on the Chamber's YouTube site. So make sure to share this and spread the word, spread the information. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you for spending some time with us, and thank you for expanding our minds to our panel and to our panel, our guests. Chris, did you have any closing words that you wanted to render?
Yes, I would. First of all, Chris, I just want to thank you for moderating this very rich solution-based discussion. I would also like to thank our panelists, Adrian, Don, and Rosina, who at the beginning of this all, I believe, declined the designation of expert. You certainly all fooled me with the perspectives you shared and the thoughts and, most importantly, the possible solutions to this issue. And I do agree, this is probably a topic that does need to be revisited again at some point. And I'm certainly going to rewatch this video myself. I would like to just thank the members of the Minority Business Network who helped facilitate this. Of course, the chamber staff, Kate Cobes and Jesse Bouclier, who worked behind the scenes to make these things possible, and our sponsors who always make these things possible: Comcast Business, Post University, Liberty Bank, and the North Star Realtors. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you all again in October for our next colorful conversation.